Our scripture reading this morning is taken from Luke chapter 6, verse 37 to 38. Do not judge, and you will not be judged. Do not condemn, and you will not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. Give, and it will be given to you. A good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over, will be poured into your lap. For with the measure you use, it will be measured to you.
Appreciated the scripture reading as well. The passage that we're looking at today, we're going to be talking some about the way we use our words. I was reminded of a story. There's a guy who decided he wanted to become a monk, and he decided to join a monastery. And as he got to this monastery, his superior there was instructing him some on what life would be like as part of that community, and said, to help you really get right in your relationship with God and to get yourself under control, for the first 7 years that you're here, I don't want you to speak a single word. And he thought about it, and it sounded rough, but the guy agreed to do it. So for 7 years, he worked, he was a part of the community, he did the things he was supposed to do. And then at the end of 7 years, his superior said, well, it's time that we had a meeting. So I'll tell you what, now that you've had 7 years of silence, I'm going to allow you to say 2 words. So what would your 2 words be? And the guy thought about it, and he said, food, bad. The guy said, okay, well, we're still working on your attitude, so why don't you take 7 more years of silence, no speaking. So the guy stayed there for 7 more years, and at the end of 7 years, once again, his superior met with him and gave him an opportunity to say 2 more words. He said, so what are your 2 words now? What would you say? And he said, bed, cold. The guy said, okay, well, how about you take 7 more years and think about it again? So he went for 7 more years of silence, and at the end of those 7 years, met with his superior, who said for the 3rd time, well, now you can tell me again 2 words. What are your 2 words? And he said, I quit. And the superior said, I'm really not surprised. You haven't stopped complaining since you got here. So I love monk humor, but thinking about the way we use our words. James chapter 3 has a pretty powerful section that talks about the way that we use our speech, and this is one of those passages of Scripture that it's like, I can't say it any better than James has already said it. So I'm going to read through this section of James chapter 3 and would invite you to be thinking about some of these ideas that he shares. He says in verse 1, not many of you should become teachers, my fellow believers, because you know that we who teach will be judged more strictly. We all stumble in many ways. Anyone who is never at fault in what they say is perfect, able to keep their whole body in check. When we put bits into the mouths of horses to make them obey us, we can turn the whole animal. Or take ships as an example. Although they are so large and are driven by strong winds, they are steered by a very small rudder wherever the pilot wants to go. Likewise, the tongue is a small part of the body, but it makes great boasts. Consider what a great forest is set on fire by a small spark. The tongue also is a fire, a world of evil among the parts of the body. It corrupts the whole body, it sets the whole course of one's life on fire, and is itself set on fire by hell. All kinds of animals, birds, reptiles, and sea creatures are being tamed and have been tamed by mankind, but no human being can tame the tongue. It is a restless evil, full of deadly poison. With the tongue we praise our Lord and Father, and with it we curse human beings who have been made in God's likeness. Out of the same mouth come praise and cursing. My brothers and sisters, this should not be. Can both fresh water and salt water flow from the same spring? My brothers and sisters, can a fig tree bear olives, or a grapevine bear figs? Neither can a salt spring produce fresh water. So kind of a long essay there on the role of the tongue and the way that our words can affect our life and our future and our destiny by the things that we say. If you've ever been to a zoo and watched a couple of shows, it's really amazing the different kinds of animals which can be tamed. Wild animals that can be taught to learn things and do tricks. But James reminds us that despite there are many types of animals that can be tamed, he says no one can fully tame the tongue. It simply isn't possible to go through life and never speak a word. You don't have the option of never speaking if you're able to speak. And so therefore it becomes really important to think about the ways that we speak. How do we use our speech? Are we using it for good or for evil? James seems to believe that, if you can find a person who has their speech perfectly under control, they've probably also got the rest of their life under control. If you can control your tongue and your words, you can probably control anything else, because controlling our speech is such a difficult thing to do. So for the last several weeks on Sunday mornings, we've been working through this series that we're calling God is Greater. That God is greater than our ups and our downs. God is greater than our highs and our lows. And this is ultimately a study on humility, because Jesus lived in such a way to really make God be greater. He humbled himself so that God could be elevated. So we've been talking about God is greater as kind of a series of steps that we can try and walk through in our lives. So to run briefly through each of these lesson topics that we've talked about, first of all, it's important to let God be God, to see him for who he is, recognize him for who he is. It's important to trust God's will even more than you trust your own will, that God knows what's best for you even more than you do. It's important that when life gets hard, that we don't give up, because God can be at work even in the worst of circumstances to bring things about for our good, or certainly for our maturing. So when life gets hard, don't give up. We've talked about how there is great healing to be found in confession, and especially when we pray for each other. When you're carrying a burden, if you just get it off your chest, share it with someone that you trust, let them pray for you. What a healing, what a blessing that is. We've also talked about last week how you really do have what you need. To have a fruitful life in God, God gives us everything that we need, and we should be people who practice contentment. And so today we're talking about another step, which is to become more like Jesus. Work on purifying your speech. Work on cleaning up the kinds of things that you say. Of the other things that we've talked about, a lot of these have to do with kind of the right outlook and the right disposition. So getting the priorities in order, knowing who God is, giving him the right place in your life. Some of the lessons over the next couple of weeks, we're going to be talking a little bit more about what that looks like on a personal level and how those things should play out in our life. And so it's very important as Christians that we use our words to build up, that we don't use our words just to tear down. So I titled this lesson, Keep Your Critique. The negative things, the harsh things that you're thinking about saying, begin by just hanging on to those. So this morning I want us to reflect a little together on how we can improve our speech habits. So I'm going to give you 3 principles that I think you might find helpful. So number 1, and this is a hard one, if you really have trouble controlling the things that you say, then try speaking only when speaking would be a genuine improvement on silence. Have you thought about that? What if I didn't say anything unless me talking would be genuinely better than saying nothing at all? Now, to be clear, I think there are a lot of things you can say that are an improvement on silence. I think you can offer words of encouragement. When you saw someone do something well, you can go up and say, hey, great job, I'm proud of you. You can use your words to tell your children that you love them, to tell your spouse that you're proud of them and you support them. There's lots of ways that your speaking can improve on silence. But if you're a person who's really prone to just gushing at the mouth, that's a good filter to begin with. Me saying what I'm thinking right now, would it genuinely be an improvement on saying nothing at all? Job's friends came to comfort him in the worst time of his life, and for several days they were a genuine help and comfort. And you know what they said during the first several days? Nothing. They just sat there with him, they cried with him, they mourned with him, and they were present. The book gets a lot saltier once his friends started trying to explain all of his problems to him and why God was doing what God was doing. And my favorite verse in Job is in chapter 13 and verse 5, where after his friends have offered their brilliant solutions as to why all his children are now dead and why he's lost everything he has and his body is covered in boils, Job says in Job 13 verse 5, if only you would be altogether silent. For you, that would be wisdom. Smartest thing you could say right now would be just shut up. Stop talking. Job gets really frustrated because of them using their words when in fact silence was a much better solution. So whether we're talking about gossip or negative speech, I was thinking about the way this can function in a family or in a community or organization, and I was kind of reminded of beach balls. I've got a little video clip. This is one of the things I figured out in Costa Rica. You should always bring beach balls with you if you're going to be encountering kids, because you don't have to teach anybody how to play with a beach ball, right? You inflate it, it's pretty, it's big, it's lightweight, and they just start hitting it. And so anytime we have downtime, I'll buy every year off of Amazon the biggest beach ball that I can find. I'll bring it with us, and anytime we need to suddenly provide entertainment for kids, they can just start hitting the beach ball. But when you think about gossip, negativity, critiquing, complaining, they can kind of function like that. After all, a beach ball is something that looks really big, but isn't it mostly just hot air? I mean, it's bright and it's colorful and it takes up a lot of space, but really there's not that much substance to it. A lot of the negative things we're tempted to say are kind of like that. Just a lot of fluff, a lot of hot air, not really anything productive. But along with that, once you see anyone else hit a beach ball, isn't your first response to try and hit it yourself? I mean, if someone hits it and it comes near you, no one has to tell you to hit it. You're just going to jump for it and go for it. And gossip's kind of like that, where you see someone else talking and it looks like they're having an interesting conversation. It's easy to say, ooh, I want to have some of that too. What is it that they're saying? Oh, have you heard about that? Did you hear what happened to that person? Did you hear what they really did or what they're really up to? Well, I just wonder what their motives are. People start talking, and it's so tempting just to get in there and start being part of the game, what everyone else is doing. But in a situation like that, what does the adult in the room have to do? If you're a teacher in a classroom and some kid gets a balloon and starts knocking it around the classroom, when you're the teacher, what's your job? Somebody's got to be the adult, grab it and say, time to stop. That's the way negative speech is as well. As a mature person, it doesn't help gossip to go to someone and say, well, I don't think this is true, but have you heard what they're saying about such and such, right? As long as you keep passing it along, it just keeps going and it keeps being a problem. But the mature thing to do is to put an end to it and to stop talking about it. Proverbs chapter 10 and verse 19 says, sin is not ended by multiplying words, but the prudent hold their tongues. So when there's sin going on and there's gossip and negativity and criticizing, when that's going on, it doesn't get better by people talking more and adding words to the fire. It only gets better when people decide to start holding their tongues. So again, what difference would it make if I try to only speak when for me to speak would be a genuine improvement on silence? James says, be very quick to listen, be anxious to listen, but be slow to talk, be slow to get angry. You remember a couple of months ago when we talked about the scoffer's seat? Were y'all here for that lesson? When we talked about the temptation to always get in the seat of the scoffer and to always complain and criticize, but to feel like I don't really have to do anything. I think very important that we should only talk if the only thing you've got to say is something negative or that's going to tear someone down. Just hang on to it and don't share it. A second principle that we can think about is that it's important to get your own house in order before you criticize someone else's. Let me say that again. Get your own house in order before you criticize someone else's. A few years ago, they made a video series on the Gospel of Matthew, and I remember one of the striking parts to me of this series, for one, it was a happy Jesus. They got an actor to play Jesus as if he were the kind of person you'd actually like to be around. He was very cheerful, he was a good teacher, he was charismatic, but when he got to this teaching, I remember the actor in that video picked up this huge plank and put it over his face and said, if you've got this big plank over your eye and you see someone else who's got a speck in their eye, don't you need to get rid of the plank before you go start trying to nitpick someone else? Jesus taught this principle. Make sure you get the plank out of your eye so that you can see clearly, to see well enough to get the speck out of your brother's eye. I feel like, this is just my personal opinion, but I really think a lot of our 24-hour news stations and also social media have created this bad trend in our culture of everyone doing all this social media activism, constant griping, constant complaining, constant attacking. You don't really trust anything you read because everything's slanted. And when people say there's a problem, they really think they've done something when they just retweeted a person, right? So I read this great article that tells it how it is, and so I'm just going to post that article on my page and look at me being an activist. Doesn't really accomplish much, does it? We need to get our own house in order. I'll tell you one young person. A lot of times we pick on millennials. Here's one millennial who I think is getting this right. His name is Boyan Slat. In 2011, he was in Greece. He was 16 years old. He and some family were off the coast of Greece, and they were fishing, intending to fish. And what he started noticing was, he said, I felt like I was seeing a lot more plastic bags than I was seeing fish. The pollution problem had gotten so bad that it was almost hard to go fish the waters. And it's that way in much of the ocean. There are enormous, enormous piles of trash that just kind of float there on top of the water. And so he said, when I saw that, I asked myself the question, why don't we clean this up? Not, why doesn't someone do something about it, but why don't we clean this up? And so he spent a lot of late nights and several years working on coming up with some kind of method to actually do something about it. And pretty quickly, he's figured out that most of the trash in the ocean tends to float near the top of the ocean. And so he's divided this method where they put up these really wide barriers. And the theory is if we can just kind of get most of it together, they're actually able to get there and pick up a lot of it. And they're even saying there are certain chunks of the ocean, specifically the North Pacific, they really believe they might be able to have garbage free by the 2040s. I mean, that's a pretty big accomplishment. But here's a guy who didn't just criticize or complain, but said, if I actually think this is a problem and really believe it's a problem, isn't it incumbent upon me to do something about it? Now, his cause may not be your cause, but you got to give the guy some credit for stepping up and doing the thing that he can. In fact, the organization that he started has now raised $30 million to work on this problem. And here's a guy just in his young 20s who's just trying to do something rather than just complain about the things that he doesn't like. And so you might look at that and say, well, the problem of pollution in the ocean, well, that's way bigger than me. That's way bigger than anything I could solve or have time to solve. But you can think about your life and the things that you have under your control. There are aspects of your life over which you do have control. There are a lot of leading thinkers these days who are talking about the importance of kind of getting your own room clean. There's a Navy SEAL admiral named William McRaven who has a best-selling book called Make Your Bed. And that's his reasoning. It's like when you get up in the morning, one thing you do have control over probably is your own bedroom. So he says, before you do anything else today, go ahead and have a victory. Go ahead and do something productive. Accomplish something before you even leave the room that morning. But the principle is if you start thinking of the little things you do have under your control, and rather than worrying about the world's big problems and fixing all the things that are wrong with the systems of government and this stuff, what if you actually started with the things you do have control over and you started putting those things in order? So if you can get your bed made, maybe you can think about next cleaning up your desk or cleaning up the room, and then you can expand from that room to another room. And of course, that's one way to think about this principle, but isn't it just as important to think about your life and your integrity and your morality? Before you go out and start criticizing everyone else's morals, well, how good are yours? Before you want to go out and start critiquing what they're doing with their money, well, what are you doing with your money? How are you raising your kids? What are you making your priorities to be? Before you start criticizing anyone else, make sure you've taken steps to put your own house in order. A third principle that I wanted you to reflect with me on this morning is one that showed up in our text that Robert read for us. Remember that God will use the same measure for you that you use for others. One of the most often quoted passages of Scripture is that verse that says, "Judge not, lest ye be judged," right? People throw that out all the time, which is basically their way of saying, leave me alone, I'm going to do what I want. But if you listen to him carefully, Jesus didn't say that you can never judge under any circumstances. What he said was, whatever measure you use for how you treat other people, that's the measure you can expect to be used for yourself. The way that you deal with God's children is the way that you can expect God, their Father, to deal with you. Truthfully, there are many occasions where we have to be pretty critical and discerning. I'll give you a couple of examples. I had one of the first couples I ever did any kind of counseling with. I was very early in ministry, and a husband and wife were having this dispute once they had their first child. They were trying to have a will in place, which is a good idea, and they're working on the will. And the dilemma they had was, if both of us die, who's going to raise our daughter? And so they started kind of talking back and forth about the two branches of the family and had some uncomfortable conversations about, love your mom, but she's kind of like this. And, well, love your dad, but doesn't he always kind of do this? And it got pretty pretty heated, and one said to the other, "How could you be so judgmental?" And his response, that I kind of agree with, is, when it comes to the well-being of my child, the spiritual development of my child, their eternal soul, I'm sorry, but I'm going to be highly critical, highly discerning of the person I would entrust with my child's well-being, were I not here myself. I think that's a circumstance where certainly you might need to apply some harsher criteria, but he's quite willing to apply those criteria to himself as well. I would hold them to the same standards that I myself ought to be held to. Important to think in those terms. Judge not, lest you be judged, for with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. I've always wondered, what if on the day of judgment, the way that God is going to respond to the sins and the shortcomings in your life were simply to play back a recording of all the things you said in your life to the people who sinned against you? What level of forgiveness do you deal out? When someone has really messed up, are you a person who gives second chances? Do you respond with harshness, or do you respond with gentleness? When you find out something juicy that's wrong with another person, are you really anxious to point that out about them, or are you anxious just to put an end to it and to not draw attention to other people's faults? What is the measure that you use for other people in your speech and in the way that you treat them? So we've been talking a lot so far about things that we need to refrain from. We need to refrain from being really harsh. We need to get our own lives in order before we start criticizing everyone else's life. But I wanted to also look at this one brief parable in Luke chapter 13, which to me provides a very positive path forward on what kinds of things we ought to do. In Luke chapter 13 and verse 6, it says, "Then he told this parable. A man had a fig tree growing in his vineyard, and he went to look for fruit on it, but did not find any. So he said to the man who took care of the vineyard, 'For 3 years now, I've been coming to look for fruit on this fig tree and haven't found any. Cut it down. Why should it use up the soil?' 'Sir,' the man replied, 'leave it alone for 1 more year. I'll dig around it and fertilize it. If it bears fruit next year, fine. If not, then cut it down.'" So we've got a fig tree here that isn't producing. And isn't it easy to look at the people in your life the same way that the owner of the vineyard looked at that fig tree? They're just not producing. They ought to be this way and they're not that way. Instead, they're this other way. They got this habit and it annoys me. They got this thing they always do and I'm bothered by it. Wouldn't it be nice just to be rid of them and avoid them and all that kind of thing? But you see the person who's tending to the vineyard who said, what if I gave them 1 more chance? What if we gave that tree 1 more year? And I'll dig around it, make sure it gets watered. I'll fertilize it. What if we really gave that fig tree an extra chance to flourish? That for us is the way that we should use our speech in our relationships. That when you see someone who's doing something that really bothers you, rather than just pull back and pronounce them as annoying or whatever you want to say about them, what if you decided to get a little closer and learn more about them? Why is it that they are the way that they are? I really believe that most people you meet have some kind of a silent battle going on at any given time you just have no idea about. In working with people, I find that to be true all the time. Most of you sitting here this morning have some kind of quiet battle you're facing, and a lot of it you just keep to yourself and God, and you don't really share with people. Everyone's got stuff they're dealing with. What if you really gave them the leeway of knowing their life is probably hard too? Maybe I could encourage them. What if you decided to be one who used your presence to make them healthier, so that when I'm going to be around them, they are going to be encouraged, that I'm going to help them see a better way, that I will believe they're capable of more? Criticism doesn't accomplish much, but love is something that builds bridges. Love is something that creates health. It strengthens and it nourishes. Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 29, I'll leave you with this. "Do not let any unwholesome talk come out of your mouths, but only what is helpful for building others up according to their needs, that it may benefit those who listen." Am I taking time to listen enough to people that I even understand what their needs are? And then do I use my presence, my words, my encouragement to make sure that because I'm talking, they were of genuine benefit for the things that I said. This morning, as you think about your own life, maybe this is one area that you do need to just dial way back. Maybe you just need to talk a lot less until you can figure out some better ways to say things. Maybe this morning, though, you're a person who does have some things that you need to say. Maybe you've got some stuff you need to get off your chest. Maybe there's something we could learn about that we could pray about for you. Maybe this morning you're ready to use your speech to name Jesus as Lord and to make a real commitment to following Him in your life. Whatever your needs are this morning, this is an opportunity that you can respond to the message if you have need. We would invite you to do that by coming forward as together we stand and sing.